John would never forget that day. Monday morning in New York, the city awoke in a thin layer of mist still lingering on the skyscrapers. Cold wind snuck through every street, pushing dry yellow leaves scattered across the sidewalks, rustling under the heels of shoes. The sound of car horns, hurried footsteps, the bells from delivery bikes, all blended together, creating a chaotic symphony that John had once thought was normal. But today, for him, every sound felt heavy, as if signaling that something was about to happen. A premonition that made his heart beat faster than usual. He stepped into the Aura Design's office, where he had dedicated 3 years of his life. This was more than just a job. It was his pride, the child of his own creative spirit. But the moment he opened the door, John sensed a strange energy. No more laughter, no more lively chatter in the workspace, only a terrifying silence. His colleagues looked at him with eyes mixed with curiosity, caution, and something he couldn't name, as if they were witnessing an important moment that he had yet to understand. John walked into the large conference room, where daylight streamed through the tall glass windows from the ceiling, casting long streaks of light across the polished wooden floor. Isabelle, the chief operating officer, and also his fiancée, stood by the table, her posture straight, her gaze sharp as a blade, her quiet smile full of pressure. She opened a file, her voice deep, warm, and firm. "John, we need to talk about the company." John's heart jolted with unease. He stepped slowly into the room, trying to suppress his anxiety. But when his eyes met Gideon's, his longtime business partner, someone he had trusted completely, a chill ran down his spine. Gideon looked at him with a cunning smile, eyes full of calculation, making John realize immediately a plot was waiting for him. And today he would be at its center. The air in the room was thick, as if all surrounding sounds had been drained away. John felt every colleague's gaze fixed on him, every heavy breath, every silent glare. He wondered, were they all witnessing a collapse that he hadn't realized yet? He inhaled, exhaled, but the anxiety made every breath feel heavy, as if pushing against an invisible pressure surrounding him. Isabelle stepped closer to the table, opened the file, her voice steady yet cold. "John, we need to discuss important changes in the board, and I think it would be best to decide today." John lowered his head to look at the documents, eyes catching numbers and lines of text he had never expected to see on his desk before. A warning sounded in his mind. Watch out. These are more than just numbers. He lifted his head, looking around. Gideon stood there, hands on hips, eyes challenging, a faint smile betraying his calculation. Isabelle scanned each employee in the room, pausing on each for a second, then returned her gaze to John, her smile still icy. John felt it clearly. Today was not a normal meeting. Today would test trust, friendship, and the power within the company. He was the only one who hadn't realized it yet. A cold shiver ran from his neck down his spine. He looked out the window, seeing the skyscrapers reflecting the morning light, but the light brought no warmth. Everything outside seemed normal, but inside this conference room, time felt suspended, each second dragging slowly enough that John could hear his heartbeat echo throughout the space. He took a deep breath, trying to contain his panic. But Isabelle's gaze and Gideon's smile made his heart pound even faster. He knew today was not just a meeting. Today he would have to face betrayal. A betrayal that had been planned long ago, every detail carefully prepared so he wouldn't have time to defend himself. Every movement was slow but deliberate, Isabelle placed her hand on the table, emphasizing each word. Gideon tapped lightly on his coffee cup, eyes never leaving John. The other employees glanced at one another, then at him, as if anticipating the outcome. John stood there, sweat beading on his forehead, heart pounding. And a question echoed in his mind. Can I hold everything together before it all collapses? The room was so thick with tension that John could hear every tick of the clock on the wall, every soft flip of a page in the file, every footstep echoing on the wooden floor. He felt the pressure from every direction, and one thought took over completely. Today, every decision, every gesture, every glance could completely change his fate, the company's fate, and even his relationship with Isabelle, the person he had once thought was his absolute ally. John stood still for a moment, trying to steady his breathing, but inside, he was still in turmoil. Everything was happening too fast for him to process. Isabelle talking about important changes, Gideon's half smile, and the silent observation of the other colleagues. He wondered why everything had turned upside down like this. He had trusted them, but now that trust seemed to shatter like glass. Isabelle closed the file, the papers lightly rubbing against each other with a soft crack that echoed in the quiet conference room. She looked at John, her gaze unwavering, voice calm. We need to vote on some important decisions regarding board shares and roles. I want to hear your thoughts. John took a sip of coffee, trying to remain composed, but his mind raced with possibilities. If they removed him from the project, would the company still be his? Gideon, with that faintly cunning smile, stood near the table, fingers tapping lightly on the wooden surface. Each tap sounded like a second heartbeat in John's chest. He glanced at the other employees. They avoided his eyes or looked at him suspiciously, and John realized it wasn't just Isabelle and Gideon calculating. The entire room seemed prepared for one outcome, pushing him out of the center of power. Part of him wanted to stand up and walk out, to shout that this was a mistake, but his rational side told him to stay cautious, observe, and wait for the right moment. Isabelle continued, Have you seen the new financial report, John? We need to make decisions based on the numbers, not emotions, and there are some ownership issues I think we should resolve immediately. Her voice was calm, but every word cut into John's pride like a sharp blade. John felt his heart pounding, but he needed to focus. He looked at Gideon, searching for a hint of honesty, but Gideon only smiled slyly. Every glance, every gesture from him was calculated. John knew his old partner was playing a game of power that he didn't yet fully understand. He took a deep breath, trying to keep his voice steady. I want to understand clearly before giving my opinion. Can you explain these changes in detail? His tone was firm but cautious. Isabelle nodded and opened the report. Numbers, charts, and lines about shares, profits, and voting rights appeared before John. Everything was presented perfectly, but inside him, his alertness increased. This was no longer a normal meeting. This was a mind game, and he was on the defensive. A few colleagues spoke up, offering mild comments about the figures. But John quickly realized those remarks weren't about the information, they were to observe his reactions. Every sentence was carefully placed to test his mindset, and he understood that any emotional reaction could be used to manipulate the outcome. John looked down at his hands, clenched slightly, tension spreading through his body. He knew that if he wasn't careful, today he could lose everything: control of the company, his position, and even trust with the people he had called allies. But a part of him stirred, a quiet determination not to be manipulated. not to let anyone destroy everything he had built. He lifted his head, looking directly at Isabelle. If we're working based on the numbers, I'll need to see the full detailed records, line by line. I want to understand everything before making a decision. His voice was firm enough to silence the room for a beat, enough for Gideon to realize that John wasn't easily fooled. Isabelle gave a slight, cold smile, also tinged with challenge. Very well. John, we'll go through the details. But I hope you understand. Time waits for no one. In that moment, John felt it clearly. Today would be a turning point. Not just a normal meeting, but a day he had to prove his worth, to strategize, and to protect everything he had built. Every gaze, every number, every gesture carried strategic meaning. And he stood there, ready, prepared to face the silent battle that no one had spoken aloud yet. The atmosphere in the conference room grew even heavier as Isabelle opened the detailed spreadsheet. Numbers danced across the pages. The financial report was presented perfectly, but John quickly realized this was not random information. Every detail had been carefully selected to apply pressure, to test his reactions, each line seemingly challenging his intelligence and composure. Gideon shrugged and smiled lightly. John, I think you'll see that things are changing, and we need to make decisions quickly. His eyes gleamed with something unreadable, like a chess player preparing to capture an opponent's piece. John felt his heart tighten. Every word, every gesture was a move in a game whose rules he hadn't fully understood. John bent over the spreadsheet. Some major shares in the company were being proposed by Isabelle to shift voting rights, shaking his position. He looked up, trying to stay calm. You're talking about transferring shares. But who will oversee this process? Is there anyone ensuring that my interests will be protected? Isabelle smiled coldly. John, we only work based on the numbers. Personal interests must follow regulations and the company's benefit. Her voice was steady, but her gaze carried a challenge, revealing her intentions. A jolt ran down John's spine. He realized Isabelle was testing him. This was no ordinary discussion. It was a test. Could he stay sharp enough to retain control and not let her reverse the situation? He took a deep breath, emphasizing each word. If you want decisions based on numbers, I need to see the full records, every transaction, every recent decision, and all related contracts. I need to be certain everything is transparent. Gideon snorted lightly, eyes scanning the room, looking at John as if he had been challenged. Very cautious, John. But remember, time waits for no one. He tapped lightly on the table, creating a rhythm that emphasized every move John made was being watched. Some of the other employees began rifling through documents, exchanging glances, seemingly waiting to see how John would react. Everything was meticulously arranged, from numbers, words, to glances and gestures, forming a subtle web of pressure John had to navigate. John felt clearly, if he lost focus for even a second, he could lose control of the company. But a part of him rose, strong and determined. He knew that to survive this mind game, he had to stay alert, observe, and plan every next move carefully. Isabelle continued, her voice calm. But every word felt like a sharp dagger. We need a quick decision on voting rights. I trust you understand that hesitation could have negative consequences. John looked into her eyes and realized this was psychological warfare. Every word, every glance, every document was designed to pressure him. His breath quickened. In his mind, He calculated. If he agreed immediately, he could lose critical control. If he resisted, he would have to prove his competence to the entire room. Heart pounding, he took a deep breath to remain composed. Eyes sweeping to Gideon, who still wore that sly, knowing smile, John noticed the morning light streaming through the windows, reflecting off the polished table, shining on papers and numbers, casting patterns of light and shadow that mirrored the mental battle in the room. Every movement became significant. A soft tap, a page turned, a fleeting glance. All could signal the next move. A sharp tap from Gideon on his coffee cup echoed through the room, causing everyone to fall silent. John knew this was the peak moment. Every observation, every pressure, all focused on him. He stood firm, his voice calm but resolute. I will review all records before making any decisions. Only when everything is transparent can I agree. Isabelle furrowed her brow, but the cold smile remained on her lips. She closed the folder, eyes sweeping across each person in the room, lingering on John for a beat longer than usual. John felt the pressure as if the entire conference room was pressing down on his shoulders, but he did not step back. A sense of determination flared. Today, he would not let anyone manipulate him, nor let anyone overturn everything he had built in that moment. John realized the plot was not only in the numbers or voting rights. It was in every glance, every word, every gesture, every pause in the room. He understood that Gideon and Isabelle had coordinated meticulously, building a web to test his mental acuity and composure. But John no longer felt fear. He took a deep breath, clenched his fists, and prepared to face each upcoming move. Then, as Isabelle returned to the table and presented her final proposal, John realized this was the decisive moment. Every number, every reaction, every glance around the room was focused on him, as if the entire conference room were holding its breath, waiting to see how he would respond. He stood there, calm, observant, and for the first time understood one thing. This mind game was not just about power, it was about survival, about everything he had built over the past 3 years. John stood there, staring at the spreadsheet, his mind exploding with thoughts. Everything was clear now. Isabelle and Gideon were not just testing him with numbers or psychological pressure. They were trying to seize power, to push him out of the center of the company. He felt his heart pounding, each beat echoing in his chest like a warning of an approaching storm. Isabelle stepped closer, her eyes cold but revealing a hint of challenge. John, you understand that the voting rights will be redistributed according to the proposal. If you don't agree immediately, the company will face risks. We only have a few minutes to decide. Her voice was even, but each word struck like a dagger. John took a deep breath, trying to contain the panic rising inside. He scanned the conference room, seeing every colleague's gaze fixed on him. Gideon standing there with his hands on his hips, a sly smile suggesting, "There's no way out for you now." John realized this was the final confrontation, where every reaction, every gesture, every word could determine the outcome. He closed his eyes for a moment, focusing on every detail, the light reflecting off the wooden floor, the rustle of papers in the folders, Gideon's subtle taps on the table. Everything was a signal. Then John spotted a small flaw in the records, a line, a number that Gideon and Isabelle had clearly overlooked. It was a clue, a gap in their plan. A surge of clarity swept through John. He opened his eyes, his voice firm but calm. I've reviewed the records. There's one point that needs clarification before we make any decisions. If this is overlooked, Any voting decision will be invalid. He paused, his gaze sweeping over Gideon and Isabelle, letting them see that he had uncovered their plot. Gideon's eyebrows raised slightly, his sly smile faltering for just a moment. Isabelle also froze, her eyes meeting John's, revealing a rare flicker of surprise. John sensed it clearly. He had shifted from a passive position to a position of control. He stepped to the table, opened the folder, and pointed to the number. According to regulations, if this number is not confirmed by the legal board, any decisions regarding voting rights are invalid. Both of you know this. His voice was calm, yet every word carried weight, silencing the room. A few employees exchanged glances, realizing that the power struggle had shifted. John noticed Gideon trying to regain composure, but his smile had lost its edge. Isabelle bent slightly forward, attempting to hide her unease, but her eyes darted across the room, realizing John had made an unexpected move. John took a deep breath, stepping forward, standing tall, eyes locked on Isabelle. I am not against the company. I only want to protect it, to safeguard what I've built. If you wish to make changes, follow the proper legal procedures. Any other action could put us at serious legal risk. In that moment, the conference room fell into a deep silence. John could hear every ticking of the clock, the rustle of papers, each step echoing lightly on the wooden floor. He sensed every gesture, every glance being calculated, but now he held the initiative. Isabelle furrowed her brow, her voice dropping slightly. John, you saw this before we did. She closed the folder, her eyes showing caution, something John had never seen before. Gideon took a long breath, trying to maintain calm, but his sly smile had disappeared. He stepped closer to John, attempting composure. All right, John. It seems you're not as easily fooled as we thought. John stood tall, feeling the pressure slowly replaced by clarity and control. He knew the battle was not yet fully over, but he had created a turning point. From a passive participant, he had moved into a position of power. And the plot of Isabelle and Gideon was now fully exposed before him. His heart still raced, but each beat carried strength. He understood that today, every decision, every move, every action he took would determine the fate of the company, the power within the board, and his relationship with Isabelle, someone who had once been an ally but had now become a rival in this intricate power game. John took another deep breath, eyes fixed on Isabelle and Gideon, voice steady yet commanding. Remember, the company doesn't belong to any individual. It belongs to those who act legally for the company and for the values we've built together. And in that moment, the conference room seemed completely still, only the soft breathing of everyone present filling the space. John knew the battle was not over, but he was no longer the passive one. He had reached the climax, ready for every next move in this cunning, high-stakes game of power. After the climax in the conference room, the atmosphere seemed thicker than ever. John felt clearly that he had turned the tables, but nothing was over yet. Colleagues' eyes were no longer fixed on him with mere curiosity or fear. Now they looked at him with cautious respect. Mixed with surprise, Gideon took a step back, maintaining an outward appearance of calm. But John knew he was calculating every word. Every gesture of John could now shift the balance of power in the company. Isabelle stood still for a moment, hands still touching the folder, her eyes challenging but slightly wavering for the first time. John saw her not fully in control. A silence stretched for a few seconds, then John spoke, his voice calm but decisive. We will conduct a detailed review of the records, following the legal procedure. Any decision regarding voting rights or share changes will be postponed until everything is transparent. He paused, eyes sweeping across all employees. Everyone has a right to participate, but it must follow the law and serve the company, not individual interests. The conference room echoed with soft sighs. Some employees exchanged glances, realizing that today's battle of wits had shifted the power dynamics. Some laughed lightly, exhaling in relief as if escaping subtle pressure. A few others glanced at Gideon and Isabelle, realizing their plot had been exposed. John felt clearly that fear had transformed into respect, and power was gradually leaning toward him. Isabelle took a deep breath, her voice dropping slightly, but still trying to stay composed. "John, I didn't expect you to notice this detail. We will follow your procedure." She closed the folder, eyes showing caution. As if considering her next move, Gideon lowered his head, trying to force a faint, sly smile, but John saw a flicker of worry in his eyes. The confidence Gideon had displayed throughout the meeting had diminished, replaced by caution and careful calculation. John knew that today he had proven he was not easily manipulated, but the feeling of victory did not make John rush to celebrate. He looked around the room, seeing everyone returning to work, but each gesture, each glance still carried caution, as if they were monitoring his every move. John understood that the consequences of today's confrontation would linger. Trust had been tested. Colleague relationships had changed, and his position in the company was no longer as before. He took a deep breath, trying to calm his still racing heart. Today, he had faced betrayal, uncovered the scheme of those close to him, and maintained control. But John also knew that this battle was far from over. Isabelle and Gideon would not give up easily, and they would find other ways to challenge him. Looking for the next weakness, he looked out the window. The skyscrapers reflected the midday sun, yet the conference room remained heavy, like an invisible weight pressing down. Every keystroke, every footstep carried unresolved tension. John felt clearly, power had been defended, but it also came with immense responsibility, constant scrutiny from colleagues, and treacherous steps ahead. A few employees approached John, whispering softly, expressing admiration and empathy. John nodded, eyes still alert, realizing that workplace relationships would be permanently changed. Everyone understood that today, a part of the company's history had been rewritten, the plot exposed, power secured, but cracks in trust would not easily heal. John sat at his desk, opening his computer, beginning to review the records again. Inside him, a feeling of both relief and tension persisted. Relief because he had overcome the first pressure. Tension because he knew every next decision would determine the company's fate and the future of his relationship with Isabelle, someone who had once been an ally but had now become a calculating rival. He took a deep breath, closing his eyes for a moment, focusing on every detail, every number, every upcoming move. John understood that today was only the beginning of a series of challenges, and he had to be ready for every twist, every strategy, every scheme that Isabelle and Gideon might deploy. Yet deep inside, he felt a firm determination. Today he had stood his ground, and he would never let anyone manipulate his company again. The conference room fell silent. Yet in John's mind, everything was still boiling. Power had been defended, but the consequences of this confrontation would continue. He looked around, took a sip of coffee, and silently promised himself, "The game is not over, and I must prepare for the next move." The next day, John arrived at the office earlier than usual. New York was bustling as ever, but for him, everything felt different. The morning sunlight reflected off the skyscrapers, yet John no longer felt the pressure from outside. Now, he focused entirely on the company, on the steps needed to maintain authority and stabilize the team. He walked past each desk, greeting everyone with friendly but firm eye contact. People responded with a mix of surprise and respect. They understood that yesterday had been a turning point, and John had proven himself capable of leading the company through unexpected challenges. John called Isabelle into his office. She entered, still composed, but her eyes no longer carried the cold sharpness from the day before. John exhaled and spoke, his voice calm but approachable. "Isabelle, yesterday we faced a lot of pressure, and I understand that both of us share the responsibility to protect the company. I want us to create a transparent plan, following proper procedures so that any changes are reasonable and fair." Isabelle nodded, her eyes softer. "John, I agree. I also want everything to be clear, and no one should be at a disadvantage. I will follow the procedure." It seemed that, after the storm of power, she realized that cooperation would be more effective than confrontation. John continued to walk through each department, talking to employees, listening to their concerns and suggestions. He realized that the team's trust had been tested, but now, thanks to careful and decisive handling, he could strengthen relationships, restore unity, and create a stronger working environment. Gideon was also invited into the office. He stood there, serious, but John sensed respect. Today, Gideon was no longer a challenger, but a partner who needed to cooperate. John said, "Gideon, I know yesterday was tense for all of us. From now on, all decisions must be transparent and reasonable. I hope you will work with me to build the company sustainably." Gideon nodded, his voice steady. "John, I understand. Let's do it together." Cooperation gradually formed, and the atmosphere in the conference room and in the company lightened, while still maintaining focus and discipline. Over the next few weeks, John devoted time to reviewing all records, checking every voting right, consolidating the company structure, and establishing transparent procedures. He worked closely with Isabelle and Gideon, turning previous conflicts into opportunities to improve efficiency and increase team trust. John also paid attention to the employees. Those who had once been hesitant or fearful were now listened to, guided, and encouraged to develop. He understood that power was not only about maintaining control, but also about creating trust, motivation, and cohesion throughout the company. One afternoon, John stood by the office window, the evening sunlight shining on the skyscrapers, and he felt clearly that today everything was more stable. He had maintained authority, handled the scheme, strengthened the team, and restored order in the company. Yet in his heart, he knew, in the business world, challenges are always lurking. He must remain vigilant, always calculating every next move. But this time, John was no longer panicked. He had learned how to stand firm under pressure, confront plots, and use his intellect to control the situation. He took a deep breath, a small, gentle smile forming. Today, he had survived the first storm of power and was ready for any challenge ahead. John returned to his desk, opened his computer, and began planning new projects. But his eyes remained alert, sunlight casting on his serious yet confident face. He knew that power, trust, and responsibility now walked hand in hand, and he was prepared for the next steps in leading the company, not only with authority, but also with wisdom and intelligence. John sat back at his desk, eyes focused on the computer screen. The office was quieter, with only the steady tapping of keyboards, occasional phone rings, and afternoon sunlight streaming through the tall windows. He closed his eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath, feeling his heartbeat steady inside. The tension slowly subsided, replaced by clarity and determination. Today, he had overcome the first challenge, turned Isabelle and Gideon's scheme upside down, consolidated his power, and restored order in the company. But John knew clearly this was not the end. In the business world, schemers never sleep. Traps and challenges always exist, and they would find other ways to seize power or test him. He looked around the room, his eyes meeting colleagues focused on their work. Some stole glances at John with admiration, while others kept their distance, cautious. John understood that the trust just rebuilt was temporary. He had to maintain authority, manage relationships, and always be prepared for any upcoming shifts. He stood up and walked toward the window, looking out at the skyscrapers, reflecting the afternoon sunlight. The lights shimmered brightly, but John knew that behind this calm, there were always hidden risks, silent moves, and undisclosed schemes. His inner voice spoke. Power isn't just about controlling everything. It's about knowing who is an ally, who is a rival, and always being prepared for the next move. He smiled faintly, a smile mixed with confidence and vigilance. The phone on his desk vibrated lightly. A message from an unknown source. We need to meet. As soon as possible. John read the line, his eyes flashing with caution and curiosity. He knew the next challenge had arrived, but this time he was no longer afraid. He had learned to stand firm, face schemes, and control the situation with intellect. John put the phone down and looked at the bustling city outside. Deep inside, a strong sense of certainty rose. Today, he had weathered the storm of power, but the game was not over. Every next decision, every move, would determine the fate of the company. The balance of power on the board, and his relationship with Isabelle, someone who remained partly an ally, yet also a calculating rival. And as the afternoon light fell on John's serious yet confident face, a calm, deep voice over-echoed, in this world, no one ever wins completely. But if you prepare correctly, you can stand firm against any scheme.